Would you like to expand your skill set as a craftsman and creator? Well, we would like to help. Each episode will be focusing in on a specific technique in blacksmithing, knife making, and beyond that will give you the edge in your work. This is your edge.
And welcome back to Your Edge, an educational show where we explain in detail the most critical technique for the craftsman. This week I will show you how to properly forge a bevel. In my hand I have a sonobe for a Japanese style tanto or wakizashi. It is made from bloom steel, which is a very traditional material that was used all across the world in the medieval era and a little bit later. Now, I'm going to show the beveling technique on this specific piece. However, before we move on to the metalwork, I have to explain how beveling actually works. You see, bloom steel, as well as most traditional materials used across the world before the modern era, had grain structure, and not the same grain structure as much as we have in modern steels. We'll get to that in a later episode. This is more like a stick of wood where strands of metal of slightly varying carbon content are running all across and along the whole piece. So this has let's say 1% carbon here, and just next to it there's a hair of 0.5% carbon, so on and so forth. So it's relatively heterogeneous. So it's just like a stick of wood. So, to show it, I'm going to use this stick of wood. So, just like my preform, this wood has a grain structure that goes this way, and it might go a little bit wonky depending on the cut. This is poplar. You can easily buy it at your local hardware store. Now, most beveling done in the United States and taught in the United States is actually wrong. Here's the reason why. What you see taught is a person taking the hammer and taking their blade and pinching out the edge. Now, let's try it on a piece of wood and look at the results. I'm going to do the wrong technique of pinching the edge. This is a very pitiful result. So obviously the pinching of the edge is an improper technique for traditional materials, because the same thing that's happening with the wood is happening with your metal if you're working with something like wrought iron or shear steel or any steel that has natural grain in it from the earliest stages of forging. So on the other side of this wonderful stick of poplar, I will show in detail what I'm going to teach. So, pay attention. What you do is, you know what geometry of an edge you'll have. So you angle your piece of steel, in our case wood, at the same intended angle to the anvil. You see there's some space here, and you match that angle with your hammer. The key is to compress the material rather than stretch it out. When you compress the material, you're generating more heat, means you can forge for longer. And all the forces equal zero, meaning your blade does not saber. And since you're compressing the grain, you're not shearing it, but rather making it tighter. At the end of this episode, I would like to actually address a common myth in blade making and how it originated. Ready? Let's try it. And let's do the other side. It's still shredded, obviously, because this is poplar and not very high quality poplar at that. However, you can see an exact bevel right here that I established in wood. And my reduction of the edge is about 1/2 of the original thickness. Now let's compare the two sides side by side. Okay. So This is what the pinching technique produces, right here. And this is what the compressing technique produces. Remember, metal, especially early metal, is very similar to wood. And now, let's try this on some metal. It will take a little bit of time for the piece to heat up. Once the tip preform is established, now it's time to work on the actual beveling. So let's heat her up again and begin. Today and for a while I'm going to be working in coal. Coal is the second best fuel medium to charcoal, in my opinion. Now, what coal and charcoal both allow is a more efficient weld and a more efficient forging because they don't contain hydrogen. So as they burn, they don't make water. Meaning you don't oxidize your billet or whatever you're working with while it's in the fire. However, you have to be very careful because both coal and charcoal burn very hot. And if you are distracted, you will melt your piece down. So you see, I'm angling my piece and I'm compressing the material. And on the other side. I work on the tip absolutely last after the rest of the piece is shaped. It is just more convenient in my experience, however it might not be true for everybody. You see, I've reduced my basically half-inch preform to what is about 3 millimeters at the edge. And it only was savoring at the tip because tips are weird. However, I can bevel the whole thing on one side in X amount of passes, and at no point will I need to straighten it. Meaning, if you use a proper beveling technique, two critical things will happen. And the third one is a benefit. The first one is you don't need to preform your blade pieces. They will come out as straight as you need them, or as curved as you want them. Second thing, if you're working with traditional materials, at all points when you're forging, you're welding the piece to itself instead of shredding it. So no more pulled welds. And the benefit of the two things is as you're forging, you're creating more heat so you can forge for much longer and use up less fuel. Be good. You see it actually, once you get into it, ready? You see, once you really get into beveling and get your technique quite right, you're compressing so much that your piece will reverse saber or yataghan itself. So it will bend a little bit towards the edge, which is not a big problem since you can fix it. However, that's also an indicator that you're putting a lot of energy into your piece and yet you're not tired and you're doing everything correctly. If I would have been pinching, what would have been happening by this would have looked like a banana snake. It would have been corkscrewed and sabered. So right here, where you see my piece is not doing the corkscrew, it is fairly straight, and it's a little bit yataghaned, but that's easily fixed, but it's not sabered this way. So this is the end result of the rough stages of beveling. Note that the piece is completely straight this way, and for the most part straight this way, with no weird adjustments of hitting it on the edges. Now, I've reduced from 1/2 inch to about 2.5 or 3 millimeter, which is the exact thing you want before grinding and heat treating. Now, let's pay careful attention to the hammering technique that is involved in beveling itself, as well as blacksmithing in general. Let's take a look. What I'm not doing I'm not punching my material. That is incredibly inefficient and very bad for your wrist. I'm not pinching. We covered that. I'm barely using my wrist or elbow. I'm only using them as a guide. They're relaxed for most of the forging, like a whip. I have, as well as most of you, an entire complex of muscles on my back. So when I forge, I utilize those. What I do is I use my shoulder and let's try slow motion because I'm actually holding right now the hammer with these 3 fingers and the handle is bumping on the pillow right here. I don't need to clench the hammer. That's why my hammers are fairly narrow this way. I can choke up with just these fingers bumping. You probably should grip it tighter, but in principle you can do it. My wrist is relaxed, my elbow is relaxed. It's my shoulder and back muscles that are doing most of the work, meaning I will not have later on chronic problems with my elbow or wrist. If you're doing it wrong, you will not live till 40 without problems here and here. That means you will not get to be good at blacksmithing by the time problems ensue. And just as you're getting good, you will not be able to forge anymore unless you use the proper hammering techniques. Avoid doing this, because if you're doing this, your back right here is strained. Try keeping it as straight of a posture as you can and use your back muscles for most of the work. It is awkward at first, but after a day of proper forging, this will be your preferred position. Fun fact, there is a misconception about forging your edge. The myth is that edge packing improves your steel grain. That is, if you forge your edge, your grain will be refined. That is not true. Modern steels develop only one kind of grain, and that is the grain that grows as a response to heat and the alloy increases the crystal. Forging does not improve that, and most of the forging is done wrong, especially by beginners, meaning forging your edge, unless you're good and follow proper heat cycling, will actually mess up your grain in modern steel. And if you think you're good and you improved your grain, any heat cycling will set the grain back to 0. Meaning, edge packing on modern steels does not work. It's a myth. Completely dubious. However, where did the myth come from? Well, traditional steels have a different type of grain. The easiest way to imagine it is looking at Damascus steel that has layers, meaning grain. It is not the grain that is developed as a result of metal responding to heat, but the grain that is inside the material as either different types of alloys or different layers with different carbon contents. So let's go to the chalkboard and take a look. Let's imagine a cross-section of my initial bar. However, it is heterogeneous, meaning there's a layer of very high carbon steel here, the next layer is lower carbon, here is an iron layer, here is high carbon, here's boom boom boom, and everything in between. If I were to grind an edge into this bar, this grain would not be guaranteed. So this would happen, and my edge can end up in the either iron or too high carbon, so on and so forth. Well, the grain is unrefined. However, if I were to forge an edge on this bar, so we're doing this, my grain will follow my forging. Meaning, I have refined my grain at the only thing that counts in your blade, and that is the edge. So if I am heterogeneous here, by the time I get to this, the grain is so close to each other, there's more carbon diffusion going on, so it's more homogeneous. And if by accident I land right on the edge on a little bit of iron or lower carbon, it will self-correct in the sharpening or in use. So I always have a high carbon edge. Now, this is the explanation for the myth of how edge packing became a thing, because it's actually described in old manuals as forging the edge refines your grain and makes the blade better. Well, this is the grain we're talking about, not the grain you're looking at when you break your blade and see if it's rough or fine. This blade is pretty much done for the forging part. If you use a proper, proficient hammering technique and focus very well on developing those skills, all you'll have to do at the end of your forging is scuff the surface with a file to remove the scale and decarb, maybe true it up again with a file, over here and over here, and you will be ready for heat treating. Now, proper forging techniques save you tremendous and monstrous amounts of time on the grinder. I don't really have to touch this blade to the grinder until maybe after the heat treat, even then. So use proper hammering techniques. Pay attention to how your back operates, your posture, make sure your elbow is relaxed, make sure your wrist is relaxed, make sure to wear eye protection, they want us to say that, and keep practicing. If you practice the hammer techniques the way I explain them and using the steps I explain, I promise your smithing will improve, you'll be better, faster, more efficient. So stay practicing and keep honing your edge.
Thanks for watching this episode of Your Edge. If you have any suggestions for future episodes, be sure to tell us in the comments below. As always, we ask you to consider subscribing to That Works.